fellow crafters, Chi-Chi here, bringing you what I hope to be one of many videos sharing different projects, craft ideas, as well as tours of my crafting corner here at home. For my first video, what I want to share with all of you is something that I made here at home using the IKEA KALLAX Drawer Insert. And I wanted something to help organize all of my Distress Oxide pads. So I transformed this drawer into my idea of a storage solution, all homemade with foam board that you can get from the Dollar Tree. When I posted this in one of the crafting communities on Facebook, got a ton of feedback. Lots of people asking about a tutorial or instructions on how to make this, so that's exactly what I'm bringing you today. Couple things to note about this type of storage solution. It is made with all foam board from the craft store and a little bit of hot glue as well. There is nothing that is actually glued to the drawer itself, and you'll see that later on in the video on how I can achieve that. So let's get started. Now we're going to go over the materials and supplies that you'll want to have on hand. You'll of course need some foam board. Again, you can pick this up at your local dollar store. A pencil, a razor or cutting knife, a ruler, and a measuring tape as well. I also do use the Cricut acrylic ruler board right here, and I'll kind of show you how I use this for taking measurements when cutting the different pieces for that organizer. For the sake of this tutorial, all measurements that I will be referencing involves the IKEA KALLAX drawer. So what you'll want to do is take your own measurements of the drawer or storage unit that you'll be using for this particular organizer. So we'll first want to measure the left and right hand sides. And we'll want to measure the length of those. So for this particular drawer, this measures 12 inches in length. And what we'll end up doing is just going 1.5 inches tall for our left and right hand side panels. I'm going to use this to cut 2 pieces that are 1.5 inches wide. Now that I have my 2 pieces cut to 1.5 inches wide, I want to now trim them down to be 12 inches long. I now have my 2 pieces that'll be for the left and right hand side of the drawer. For our next set of measurements, we'll want to insert the left and right hand pieces and measure the width of the drawer so that way we can cut our dividers accordingly. So the width between these 2 pieces will measure 10.5. For the dividers, you'll want to cut them at 2 inches wide, and we'll trim them down to be 10.5 inches in length once we have all 8 pieces cut. Now that I have all 8 dividers cut to 2 inches wide, we're now going to trim them to 10.5 inches in length. You'll see that some of my cutting was a little bit uneven, but that's okay because once I trim it down, that piece will be irrelevant. So you'll want to trim each piece down to 10.5 inches in length. You should now be left with 8 dividers that measure 2 inches wide and 10.5 inches in length. We're going to set these aside for the time being and go back to our left and right hand pieces. With our left and right hand pieces that will run the length of the left and right hand side of the drawer, go ahead and just select one of these pieces to start with. And what we'll want to end up doing is making reference marks every 1.5 inches along the length of both ends of this piece. So now we're going to create little reference marks every 1.5 inches along the length of this piece on both sides. And then we'll just turn this around and just mirror the same thing on the other side. Now what we're going to do with these reference lines is we're actually going to draw diagonal lines from one corner to the other. And these don't need to be absolutely perfect, but these will just be a line that we'll use for reference later on when we go to add our dividers. And then your piece should now look something like this. Go ahead and grab the other side, which actually this will ultimately end up being the left-hand side. This will be the right-hand side. And what we'll want to do is do the same thing with the right-hand side piece, but draw our lines now going in the opposite direction. So once again, go ahead and make your little reference marks every 1.5 inches along the length of this piece on both ends. Turn that around and mirror the same thing. And now what you want to do is draw your diagonal lines going the other way. So you should now have your left and right hand pieces with diagonal lines drawn. You can kind of get an idea as to which side is going to be the left and which side is going to be the right hand side based on the angle of the lines and how the dividers will rest. So let's move on to getting our dividers glued into one of these pieces. For this next step, I actually forgot to mention that you're going to want your trusty hot glue gun so that we'll begin to glue the dividers perpendicular to the left or right hand side pieces. I personally like to start with the left hand piece, but doesn't matter, it's the same steps either way. So Using these reference lines that we drew earlier, we're going to lay down strips of glue along each line as we glue on the dividers to each line. And just like that, we'll just glue it perpendicular to the left-hand piece here that I'm starting with. And you'll just want to hold it in place for a few seconds, just enough so that it'll stand on its own. Now, don't worry if it's not going to stand straight up. It's okay to have a little bit of flex in there that will work to our advantage when we go to place this in the drawer. Now, looking at what would end up being the underside of this divider, I like to add a little bit of extra glue as reinforcement. So I'm just going to add some extra glue underneath there, just like that. So you'll want to repeat this step for every single reference line that we drew, so you'll end up with 8 pieces glued perpendicular to this side panel. All right, so my final piece is in. You can kind of see how they're not quite evenly standing straight up, and again, that's okay. They're going to have a little bit of flex to them, which will work in our advantage once we go to place this in the drawer. So let's go grab our empty drawer and start to put this organizer together. So here I have that IKEA KALLAX Drawer unit. I have my left side piece with all of my dividers glued on, and then I've got my right side piece that I'm going to insert first. Kind of hold that in place, and then I'm going to gently sort of wedge this in here. Just like that. And using the reference lines that we drew on that other side here, we're going to position the dividers accordingly. All right, everything kind of looks good to me. Now that you've got your organizer placed in the drawer, you can go ahead and add some extra hot glue on the underside of the dividers as best as you can, again, just for extra reinforcement and to help keep them in place. So I've now added glue to the underside of the dividers. And that'll just help add some reinforcement on now both ends of it as you go to place your ink pads in place. So now here you can see the before and after of this homemade organizer. Coincidentally, what I found was that the distance between each divider being 1.5 inches apart was the perfect width for these ink pads to rest in. And so now you can just go ahead and start placing your ink pads in place. These you can see can fit 3 across, and this organizer yields 8 rows. And I wouldn't necessarily call this dead space right here because you can see that I've got my applicator handles right here. I hope you found this tutorial super helpful. You can of course apply the same application to any sort of storage or organizing needs, whether you want your items to be displayed on an angle, such as these ink pads, or perhaps keep your dividers perpendicular to compartmentalize certain products that you want to organize. Thank you again so much for tuning in. Again, I hope this will be one of many videos to share with you different projects, crafting ideas, as well as tours of my crafting corner here at home. Thanks again.